Out here on the wild steppe, the wind don't always bring gold. Sometimes it carries stories. Stories about the forgotten, the quiet ones. The ones who weren't strong enough, loud enough, or big enough to be remembered until they were. This is one of those stories. A tale of a woman too small for the world around her, too quiet to be chosen, too soft to be wanted, too fragile. Some said to survive the Wild West. They left her on the train platform with a torn dress and a trembling heart. But out here, out where men still built cabins with bare hands and hope was carved into pine logs, she found something no one expected. She found a giant not just in size, but in silence. A man who didn't speak much, but knew how to build what no one else could. Not just a roof, not just four walls, but a life. Stay with us, because here on the Wild Steppe, Wild West stories, we don't just tell tales of cowboys and shootouts. We tell the stories of second chances, of quiet strength, and of the kind of love that grows where the wind never stops. In the sweltering heat of a July morning in 1886, a woman stepped down from a dusty train in the heart of Colorado Territory. Her name was Margaret Whitlow, and she carried with her only a single suitcase, a letter folded 12 times over in her pocket, and a pounding heart. At 48 years old, Margaret had lived enough life to recognize desperation in her hands, in her breath, in her very bones. But she had also lived long enough to know when a risk was worth taking. The letter had come from a man named Thomas Callahan, a widowed rancher from Pine Bluff, a small outpost town tucked between the Rockies and the hard-pan plains. He had written of needing a wife, a helpmate, someone with a strong back and a stronger spirit to help raise two daughters and manage a sprawling, if struggling, ranch. Margaret had responded not with hope, but with resolve. London had given her nothing but shadows of a husband lost to whiskey, a dressmaking shop swallowed by debt, and a name that no longer opened doors. So when the last of her savings bought her a third-class ticket westward, she didn't cry. She stitched her last name into her only good dress, fastened her shawl, and boarded the ship to America with a heart wrapped tight in silence. But the man who met her at the platform wasn't the man from the letter. He wasn't tall, he wasn't weathered, and he wasn't alone. Three men waited at the platform, one thin and fidgety, one portly and flushed, and the third with cold, appraising eyes that missed nothing. It was the last one who stepped forward. "You, Margaret Whitlow." She blinked once slowly. "Yes, and you must be—" "Tom Callahan's dead. Been gone 3 months now." The words hit like a gunshot. The man continued without apology. "Name's Curtis Langley. I run the Blacktail Ranch. Tom was renting grazing rights from me when he passed. Had no kin to speak of. I've found your letters in his things. Figured someone ought to tell you not to come. Guess I was too late." Margaret stood still. The dust of the train drifted around her boots, catching in the folds of her skirt. She felt the heat of the sun on her neck, the weight of 30 years of quiet disappointments settling on her shoulders again. "I see," she said finally. Langley nodded once, then tilted his hat back to study her more openly. "Suppose you're in a fix now. You got people to go back to." "No. Money." She hesitated. "Very little." He nodded again. "Well then, maybe you ought to know there's work in Pine Bluff if you don't mind cooking for rough men. Saloon's always short a girl who can keep a pot simmering and her mouth shut." He turned then, walking off without another word, leaving Margaret alone on the platform with the sting of dust and dishonor. She didn't cry. Not then. Not as the train pulled away and left her alone. Not as the station emptied and the shadows of the depot stretched long in the late morning sun. But she did sit, quietly, on a bench that creaked beneath her weight. And for the first time in months, she let herself feel every bruise that hope had left behind. A boy passed by with a tray of lemonade, his face sticky with sweat and freckles. She bought a glass with one of her last coins. It tasted of tin and lemons, not quite ripe, but it was cold and it gave her something to hold. She had no plan, no direction, Just the bitter taste of betrayal on her tongue and the grim clarity that comes only when every illusion has been scraped raw. That was when she saw him. He stood at the edge of the platform, half in shadow, half in sun. A giant of a man with broad shoulders and the kind of quiet stillness that comes from years lived close to the bone. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched her. And when their eyes met, he tipped his hat. Margaret looked away first. But in that fleeting moment, something passed between them. Not a spark, not quite, but something older, like recognition or the weary kindness of one soul to another. She would come to know him as Elijah McCall, a man with his own past, his own scars, and a silence that had weight. But that would come later. For now, she sat in the sun, clutching a warm lemonade, and a colder truth she had gambled everything on a lie. But she was not done fighting. She would never be done fighting, not while breath remained in her body. That evening, with the depot benches emptied and the sky painting itself in shades of amber and violet, Margaret wandered down the main road of Pine Bluff. The town was a rough sketch of civilization, all splinters and rust. A general store, a blacksmith, a church that leaned slightly to one side, and a saloon that leered out from the corner with swinging doors and yellow light. The sign above it read, "The Dusted Boot." She didn't go inside. Instead, she stood across from it, staring like a woman appraising a gallows. She could almost hear Langley's words echoing, "Saloon's always short a girl who can keep a pot simmering and her mouth shut." Margaret's mouth had never stayed shut when injustice was served. She had never been particularly skilled at obedience, but she was skilled with her hands with thread and cloth, and with the quiet resolve of women who had buried husbands' dreams and illusions alike. She turned away. That's when she saw him again. The giant man, Elijah McCall. This time he was closer, leading a pack mule from the general store. He paused when he saw her, tipped his hat again. "Evening, ma'am." She nodded, her throat dry. "Evening." He stood silent for a beat, then said, "You need a place to stay." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. There's an old bunkhouse on my land, empty, clean. You're welcome to it until you get your feet under you." Margaret stared. "You don't even know me." "I don't have to. I saw your face this morning. Saw the way you didn't flinch when Langley spoke. Seen that kind of look before." She swallowed. "What kind of look?" He adjusted the reins. "The kind that says a person's lost everything but still too proud to lie down." A long pause. "What's the catch?" she asked finally. "No catch. You help with meals if you want. Maybe mend some gear. I got horses that could use saddlebags repaired. That sort of thing. I ain't offering charity, just shelter." Margaret's hand tightened on the handle of her suitcase. Her instincts warred with exhaustion, with fear, with need. Finally, she nodded. "All right." Elijah simply said, "Come on, then." They walked into the twilight without another word. And just like that, Margaret Whitlow's second chance began, not in glory, not in ceremony, but in the steady footsteps of two strangers moving side by side into the unknown. The road out of Pine Bluff unraveled in silence, a winding ribbon of dust and dusk that threaded its way between low hills and the slow skeletal outlines of scrub trees. The air had cooled and the stars began to push through the bruised horizon one by one like watchful eyes blinking open. Elijah McCall said little as they walked. His long stride slowed enough to match hers, and he adjusted the mule's pace with the easy touch of a man who knew animals better than most men knew kin. Margaret trailed beside him, her suitcase growing heavier with every step, though she refused to ask for help. Pride, after all, was the last possession she hadn't pawned. "Not far now," Elijah murmured. His voice was low and calm, like distant thunder on a summer night, promising rain, but not threatening. Margaret glanced at him sideways. He didn't look at her, but he hadn't stopped noticing her either. She could feel it, that quiet awareness, like standing beside a river just before it floods. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, they turned off the main path and followed a trail barely wide enough for the mule's hooves. A single lantern slung from the saddle bobbed and swayed in the growing dark, casting flickering gold over the ground and the tangled branches above. Eventually, they reached a break in the trees. The homestead appeared not all at once, but in layers. First, the smell of wood smoke, warm and sharp, then the silhouette of a small barn, a corral, a low two-room cabin with a shingled roof and smoke curling from the chimney like a welcome hand. And just beyond it, tucked beside the trees like a secret, a small bunkhouse with a porch no wider than a coffin lid and a single window glinting under the stars. Elijah led the mule to the barn without a word. Margaret stood in the yard, suitcase at her feet, heart loud in her chest. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full of wind, of crickets, of 1,000 miles between who she had been and who she might yet become. He returned minutes later, a folded blanket under one arm and a dented kettle swinging from his hand. The bunkhouse is clean. Got a cot, wood stove. I'll bring water in the morning. You'll need it. He paused. It gets cold some nights, even in July. Margaret nodded. Thank you. Elijah set the blanket inside and propped the door open. She stepped in slowly. The space smelled of cedar and dust. Simple as promised. A cot, a stove, a table, a cracked mirror nailed above a wash basin. No frills, but no filth either. Everything bore the shape of use, not neglect. She turned to him. Do you offer this kindness to every stranger who shows up heartbroken on your depot's bench? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Just the quiet ones who drink lemonade with dignity. Her laugh surprised them both. Dry, soft, but real. He tipped his hat. Sleep well, Miss Whitlow. She hesitated at the threshold. It's Margaret. He gave a slow nod. Margaret. She closed the door behind him and slid the latch into place. The click echoed like a promise. That night, Margaret unpacked her suitcase. It didn't take long. She laid out the small treasures that had followed her across an ocean and 2,000 miles of rail, a pair of bone-handled scissors, a spool of red thread, a folded scrap of muslin embroidered with her initials, and a silver locket with no picture inside. A mirror to memory more than a keepsake. She changed into her nightdress, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and sat on the cot with the kettle heating beside her. Outside, the world breathed in cottonwood and silence. Inside, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to close her eyes and not feel hunted. The days that followed passed like pages from someone else's book. Margaret rose early, often before sunrise, the eastern sky still a dull silver behind the trees. Elijah had already gone most mornings, leaving a small bundle on the porch. Cornmeal biscuits wrapped in a towel, a tin mug of strong coffee, sometimes a note in spare slanted script. There's a fence needs mending, no rush, tools in the barn, or if you feel up to it, saddle blankets torn. Would be grateful for a hand. He never gave orders, only requests, and always with space built in for refusal. She never refused. Margaret found herself mending saddlebags with hands that remembered fine corsets and silk trim. She patched shirts, boiled beans, scrubbed a floor whose boards knew the weight of solitude. She did it not for wages nor pity, but because something about the work felt honest, restorative. At night, Elijah would return. They ate at the table inside the main house, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and long stretches of silence that didn't ache. On the third evening, she brought her sewing kit into the house and set it on the table. I noticed the hem of your duster's unraveling. He glanced at it, then at her. You don't have to. I know, she said, but I want to. Elijah gave a single nod and shrugged out of the coat. He folded it and laid it beside her, then set about slicing potatoes without another word. It was the first time he let her fix something of his. And she did it with reverence. That night, when she returned to the bunkhouse, there was a candle burning on the window ledge. A small thing, but it made her blink twice before stepping inside. The sun rose lazy on the 4th morning, spilling gold across the cottonwood branches like honey poured too slow. Margaret stepped out of the bunkhouse with a shawl over her shoulders and a biscuit in hand, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and dew. Elijah was already in the yard, sleeves rolled, hammer in one hand, sawing planks beside a small foundation staked out beneath the trees. He looked up only once as she approached and offered a nod. "What are you building?" she asked, voice soft in the morning hush. He drove another nail before answering. "A cabin." Her brows lifted. "A cabin." He stood, wiped his forehead with the back of one calloused hand. "Figure it's time I added something more permanent." That bunkhouse was meant for drifters and field hands, not someone sewing lace curtains and baking real bread. Margaret flushed, unsure whether to be offended or flattered. "I didn't ask for anything permanent," she said after a moment. "I know," he replied, "but you deserve more than borrowed space." She folded her arms, steadying herself. "And what exactly do you think I am, Mr. McCall?" Elijah didn't flinch. "I think you're a woman who's been given half the respect she earned. A woman who came here on a lie and stayed anyway. That says more about character than any letter ever could." Silence fell like a stone between them. Finally, she said, "And what would I owe you for this generous cabin?" His answer came without hesitation: "Nothing." She stared at him, searching for the trick, the expectation. But there was none. Just the steady calm of a man who'd learned not to speak more than he meant. "May I help?" she asked. He handed her a second hammer. Over the next week, the cabin began to take shape. It started with foundation stones rolled in from the creek bed, then timber hauled down by mule and squared by Elijah's broad hands. Margaret helped where she could, sorting nails, smoothing rough boards, laying planks for the floor. At night, she returned to the bunkhouse with aching arms and a strange sense of joy blooming behind her ribs. Not joy exactly, something quieter, more dangerous. Hope. Each evening, they ate together by lamplight. The conversation was simple: weather wolves, how many nails remained in the crate. But the silences between them had changed. Less guarded, less hollow. One night, Elijah paused over his stew and said, "You ever miss it?" She looked up. "Miss what?" "Where you came from. London wasn't it?" She nodded, chewing slowly. "Sometimes, but not the city. The sound of the bells, maybe. The smell of lavender in spring. The bustle of it. But I don't miss who I had to be there." He considered that. What was she like, the woman you had to be? Margaret set her spoon down. She smiled at men who didn't deserve it, counted coins every night to see if she'd survive another week, taught herself not to dream. "And the woman you are now, she knows how to hammer a roof beam," she said dryly. Elijah chuckled, a low, unexpected sound that warmed the walls of the little kitchen. They didn't speak of feelings, of past, but it settled between them like a warm quilt shared work. Quiet company, two lives weathered by time but still willing to stretch towards something new. By the second week, the cabin had a door. By the third, a porch. Elijah came to her one evening with a square window frame under one arm. "I remember you said you'd want light," he said, "especially where you sew." Margaret took the frame from his hands, touched the edge of the wood. "Thank you." He stepped back, nodded once, then turned to leave. She stopped him at the threshold. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Then, with quiet gravity, he said, "Because I know what it's like to come looking for a place and find a dead end instead." That night, Margaret lay awake beneath her thin blanket, staring at the ceiling, the words echoing like a prayer in the hollows of her chest. She had not asked for kindness, but she was learning how to accept it, and that she knew was a harder thing than it seemed. It started with thunder, not the kind that rumbles politely along the far-off peaks, but the kind that cracks the sky wide open and makes animals bolt for cover. The first strike hit just past midnight, lighting the valley with a jagged scream of white. Margaret sat bolt upright in her cot, heart racing. The bunkhouse trembled slightly with the second clap. Rain followed fast, heavy and urgent, pounding the roof like angry fists. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, bending them low, as if the land itself were bowing to something it could not stop. She scrambled from bed and pulled on her boots, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The rain was already seeping in through the warped seams of the bunkhouse, a dark stain spreading across the far wall. She grabbed her sewing kit, her Bible, and the small box of keepsakes, stuffing them into her case before water could ruin them. Then she opened the door. The night swallowed her. The wind caught the door and wrenched it wide. Rain slapped her face as she stepped into the storm, stumbling across the yard toward the main house. Lightning lit the path in strobes, each flash revealing the wildness of the trees, the slanting sheets of rain, the fury of a sky unhinged. She reached the porch, breathless, soaked through teeth already chattering. The door opened before she knocked. Elijah stood there barefoot, shirtless, lantern in hand. His eyes widened when he saw her. The roof leaking, she gasped. He stepped aside instantly. "Come in." The warmth of the main house hit her like an embrace. The fire in the hearth had been banked low, but its glow danced across the walls, casting deep shadows. Elijah set the lantern down and took her shawl. "You're soaked." "It came fast," she said, still clutching her case. "I know." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a wool blanket. She let him wrap it around her, her fingers trembling from more than cold. "It's bad out there," she said. "Worse than I've seen." "It'll pass. These mountain storms burn hot and quick." He poured her a cup of something warm from the kettle on the stove. It tasted of chamomile and honey. She sipped in silence, the warmth working its way into her chest, her limbs. Lightning flared again, bright enough to show the lines of worry in Elijah's face. She realized then how closely he'd been watching the storm, how ready he had been for someone to need him. "I'll fix the bunkhouse roof," he said. "Come morning." "You don't have to." "I said I would." Something in his voice silenced her. They sat in two chairs before the fire, neither speaking for a long time. Rain battered the windows. The wind screamed, then softened. The storm, like all storms, began to fade. But inside, the silence held. Margaret glanced at him. His arms rested on his knees, hands clasped. Scars ran along his left forearm, long-healed things that spoke of accidents or fights he hadn't yet told her about. She didn't ask, not tonight. Instead, she said, "What were you like before this?" He looked at her. "Before the ranch, before Wyoming." A pause. "I was younger," he said, "and angrier." "About what?" "Everything." He leaned back, eyes still fixed on the fire. "I left Tennessee after the war, lost too much, came west to forget, never quite managed it." "Do you still want to forget?" "No." He looked at her then, "Not anymore." They stared at each other for a long time, not speaking, just seeing. The fire popped softly between them. Then quietly Margaret said, "Would you sit beside me, not across from me?" He rose and moved to the settee sitting a foot away. She didn't lean in, neither did he. But the space between them changed. From empty to possible. By dawn the storm had passed. The bunkhouse roof was damaged but not lost. Elijah inspected it that morning with quiet focus, and Margaret worked beside him, handing up tools, holding boards steady, neither of them speaking about the night before. But something had shifted, something permanent. That evening, he brought her a bundle wrapped in linen. "What's this?" she asked. He shrugged. "Found it in the back of the barn. Figured it might help." Inside were rolls of fabric, some faded, some fine, all clean. Spools of thread. A wooden box of pins, a thimble of silver. She held it all like it was holy. "You're giving this to me. I'm giving it back to someone who knows what to do with it." That night, she stitched long into the dark by candlelight, her hands steady and sure. And when she laid the finished square of cloth over the window frame in the bunkhouse, it wasn't to block the light, it was to frame it. The air in Pine Bluff softened as August crept in, the heat still present, but tempered by a slow breeze that carried the scent of pine sap and river dust. Cicadas buzzed in the afternoons, and the tall grasses waved like golden oceans beneath the sun. Margaret had been on Elijah McCall's land for nearly a month. By now, the bunkhouse no longer felt like borrowed shelter. Her curtains hung at the window, stitched with care and trimmed in the blue thread she'd carried from England. A wooden crate served as a shelf for her thimble Bible and the tiny muslin bag of coins she hadn't yet touched. Her scissors gleamed in a mason jar, and in the evenings her fire burned steady. But it was the space between the bunkhouse and the cabin, the part where she and Elijah worked, passed tools, shared coffee, and measured lumber together, that had changed most of all. The new cabin stood nearly finished now. Each day, Elijah brought her small things for it without asking: a basket for kindling, a mirror with a chipped frame, a lantern with a green glass shade, and each time Margaret thanked him with something stitched, patched, or baked. The rhythm of their days became a kind of language spoken not with words, but with quiet gestures. Fresh biscuits left on the porch, a sharpened axe blade waiting beside the stump, a pot of beans seasoned just how he liked them. A second mug poured before he asked. One evening, as they sat beneath the porch of the main house, watching the last of the sun dip behind the hills, Elijah said, "You sow the way some folks pray." Margaret looked at him. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "I mean it's steady, with care. Like each stitch is a way of asking the world for mercy." She stared at him, lips parted slightly. Then she laughed. "You surprise me sometimes." He took a sip from his tin cup. "Most folks don't bother listening long enough to be surprised." The breeze tugged at the hem of her dress. The chickens clucked sleepily near the barn. Somewhere down by the creek, frogs began their evening chorus. She said, "And you, Mr. McCall, do you ever pray?" He was silent for a moment. "Then not in the way most think of it, but I talk to the land, to the fire, to the ghosts I've got following me." "And do they answer?" He looked at her, then eyes clear in the fading light. "Sometimes." Margaret didn't know what made her do it. Maybe it was the way the porch creaked like a stage waiting for a final line. Maybe it was the softness of the moment, or the fact that no one had looked at her with such unspoken respect in years. She reached over and laid her hand on his. Just a moment, just warmth. Elijah didn't move. He simply turned his hand over so their palms touched. And the porch, the dusk, the whole spinning earth seemed to pause long enough for two worn souls to recognize one another in full. When she stood to return to the bunkhouse, he didn't stop her, but his voice followed her down the steps. "Margaret." She turned the wind, lifting her shawl. He stood there, arms crossed, boots planted wide. "That cabin, it's yours, not just for now, for good." She opened her mouth to protest. He raised a hand. "No payment, no promises, no strings. I've lived too long in silence. I'd rather build something with someone who knows the weight of being alone." The world tilted slightly under her feet. Then she smiled, a true smile, and said the only thing that made sense. "Then I suppose we'd best finish it before winter." It came in the form of hoof beats. Not loud at first, just the faint drumming of hooves carried on the wind, out of rhythm with the usual ranch traffic. Margaret heard it before Elijah did. She was at the well drawing water into a wooden bucket when the sound caught her ear, fast, uneven, unfamiliar. By the time Elijah stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, the rider had already cleared the ridge. He was young, barely more than a boy, dust-streaked shirt clinging to his back horse, lathered and skittish. As he galloped into the yard, he barely pulled the reins before leaping down, breath coming in gasps. "Mr. McCall," he shouted, "you gotta come quick. Fire just past Cold Creek. Jump the east line." Elijah was already striding toward him. "How far?" "Maybe 5 miles and closing." Wind shifted west. "We can't hold it with what we got." Margaret stepped forward, heart pounding. "What kind of fire?" "Grass mostly," the boy said. "But it's hungry. She's running fast." Elijah didn't hesitate. He turned to her, his face all calm control. "I've got to ride. There's a line of cabins out near the ridge, if it catches the trees." "I'll be fine," Margaret said, cutting him off. "You go." He nodded, once already saddling his horse. But just before he mounted, he turned back to her. His voice was quiet, just for her. "If the wind shifts again, you get to town. Take the mule. Don't wait for me." Her throat tightened. "I won't leave unless I have to." He looked at her, really looked like he might say more. But the wind rose behind them, carrying the smell of distant smoke, and he rode hard into the growing dusk. For the next hour, Margaret worked like a woman possessed. She soaked gunny sacks and draped them along the bunkhouse walls. She filled barrels, hauled water, doused the cabin's roof with every bucket she could lift. The air began to shimmer with heat, not from the sun, but from the threat galloping closer. Then she saw it, just beyond the low ridge to the east, a bloom of red against the sky. It wasn't yet close enough to burn them, but the smoke was creeping, slinking down the slopes like something alive. Her eyes stung, her throat burned, But she kept working, stacking her few belongings inside the cabin and tying them in bundles ready to load if needed. And then she waited. The sun slipped behind smoke and cloud, casting the world in a strange coppery light. The prairie fell quiet as if holding its breath. She thought of Elijah, of the way he watched storms, the way he had looked at her across the table, the way he'd said, "You deserve more than borrowed space." And she realized with startling clarity she didn't want to survive this just to keep breathing. She wanted to survive it for him. It was well past midnight when the riders returned. Margaret was asleep on the porch boots, still on a wet rag across her chest. The sound of hooves brought her instantly upright. Lanterns bobbed, voices carried. Elijah. He was smoke-streaked and ash-dusted, a line of soot along his jaw, but he was whole. She rushed down the steps before she could stop herself. He dismounted stiffly, shoulders slumped, and as soon as his boots hit dirt, she threw her arms around him. No words, just the solid truth of his presence against her chest. He held her tight, burying his face in her shoulder, breathing in the scent of flour and cedar smoke. "It jumped the far ridge," he murmured. "Took out some fencing, 2 barns. But we held the line." "You're safe," she whispered. "I am now." They stood in silence, the fire still burning somewhere out in the night, but no longer threatening their world. Later, as Elijah leaned back in a chair, boots off, hands scraped, Margaret knelt beside him and washed the cuts on his arms with warm water and cloth. "I never asked," she said, "why you stayed so far from people." He looked at her, eyelids heavy. "Because losing people hurts more than being alone." "And now?" He hesitated. Now I think I might have been wrong." She didn't speak, just kept dabbing gently, her touch more healing than the water itself. That night they both slept in the cabin, not because the bunkhouse was damaged, not because the storm demanded it, but because something had shifted again, and neither wanted to pretend otherwise. The autumn winds arrived early that year, bringing with them a restless chill that curled under doors and whispered through the cottonwoods. Margaret had begun stitching heavier curtains, lining them with muslin and fleece. Elijah reinforced the cabin's window frames and stocked the woodshed with double the usual kindling. Life, it seemed, was settling. But peace, Margaret had learned long ago, was never earned easily. It was a Tuesday afternoon, clear sky, mild breeze, when the past came riding into Pine Bluff on a gray gelding, wearing a bowler hat and a London-cut coat entirely wrong for the prairie. She didn't see him arrive. She heard about it from Mrs. Falk at the general store, who came by to trade eggs for a repaired apron. "Said he's looking for a Margaret Whitlow," the woman said casually. Had a British accent, thick as gravy, and a face like someone stepped on his inheritance. Margaret's blood ran cold. She stood there, thimble in hand, and forgot how to breathe. "What did he say his name was?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Didn't," Mrs. Falk replied. "But he sure wasn't from around here." Rode in with questions, not greetings. Odd that. Margaret barely heard the rest. She sat on the edge of the porch long after Mrs. Falk had gone, her needlework forgotten in her lap. The air felt too tight, her skin too thin. There were names she'd buried with the Atlantic Ocean, faces she'd sworn never to see again. And one of them had come calling. Elijah found her there an hour later. "You're pale," he said, setting down a crate of supplies. "Something wrong?" She nodded slowly, not looking at him. "Someone's come. From London." His jaw tightened. "Man named," she stopped herself. "He didn't give his name. But I know who it is." Elijah waited. "My husband's brother," she said finally. "Rupert Whitlow." He said nothing, just sank down beside her on the step. "He hated me," she went on, voice flat. "Thought I'd ruined his family. Said I drove Charles to drink, that I was nothing but a shop girl with delusions of class. When the shop failed, he said it proved him right." "Did he hurt you?" Elijah asked, his voice low. Margaret hesitated. "Not with fists, but words can bruise deeper than bone." Elijah looked towards the east, where Pine Bluff shimmered in the distance like a mirage. "What does he want?" "I don't know. But he wouldn't come this far unless he needed something, or unless he meant to take something." Her voice broke slightly. Elijah stood. "You stay here. I'll ride to town." She reached for his arm. "No, this is mine to face." They rode in together side by side just past noon. The town was quiet, save for a few wagons rattling by and a dog asleep in the shade of the saloon. But when they turned the corner onto Main Street, Margaret saw him. Rupert, older, of course, grayer at the temples, but still immaculate, still smug, still the same cold eyes that had followed her every failure in London. He saw her and smiled an expression that bore no warmth. "Margaret," he said, removing his hat with theatrical courtesy, "you're alive. Remarkable." Elijah bristled beside her. Margaret dismounted slowly. "Why are you here, Rupert?" "To bring you home, of course." She blinked. "Home? You think I'd return to England after everything?" Rupert stepped closer. "Your husband's estate, such as it was, left a few unresolved debts. The family name still matters, you know. And unfortunately, so does your signature on the old leases." Margaret's throat tightened. That was years ago. And yet Rupert said smoothly, "The bank insists on closure. I thought I'd do you the courtesy of delivering the news in person." Elijah stepped forward, towering beside her. "She's not going anywhere," he said. Rupert turned. "And you are—" "Elijah McCall. She's under my roof, my protection." Rupert's smile turned sly. "How very frontier." He looked back at Margaret. "Think on it. You can come back willingly, or I can make things difficult. I have papers, lawyers. You've always been fond of dignity. Don't lose it now." He turned and walked away, dust rising around his polished boots. Back at the cabin, Elijah paced while Margaret sat still. "He's bluffing," she said. "There's no way they can touch me here. Not truly, but he knows how to make a person feel small." "You're not small," Elijah growled. She looked at him. "What if he starts whispering things around town about who I was, about the debts, about the shop, the drinking?" Elijah crouched beside her, took her hand. "Margaret, no one here cares about what happened across an ocean. They care about who you are when their horse is lame or their child needs mending. You've built something here. No one gets to take that." She blinked back tears. He added, "And if that man wants a fight, he picked the wrong patch of land." For the first time since she'd arrived in Pine Bluff, Margaret could not sleep. The cabin walls, once comforting, now felt too close. Her breath caught in her chest. The old ghost she'd thought buried in England had found her again, riding across oceans, trailing behind papers and polite threats. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Inside, the fire burned low. Elijah had offered to stay in the main house to give her space. She had accepted not because she wanted distance, but because she needed to think. Her whole life, Margaret had made decisions out of fear. Fear of scandal, fear of hunger, fear of being alone. Even the journey to America had been born less from courage and more from the raw knowledge that there was nothing left behind her. Now, for the first time, there was something to lose. A place, a rhythm, a man who saw her not as a burden, not as a fallen woman, but as a whole soul. And Rupert threatened all of it. She rose before dawn, lit the stove, boiled water, sewed for an hour while the kettle hissed just to still her hands. When the sun cracked the horizon, she saddled the mule and rode into town. The sheriff's office in Pine Bluff wasn't much, just a single room, a desk, a wall of wanted posters, and a pot-bellied stove that hadn't been lit in weeks. Sheriff Thomas Denton was a man of quiet words and large mustaches, the kind who weighed every sentence before speaking. He listened as Margaret explained. Everything. Her husband's debts, Rupert's visit, the forged threats, her fear that he might start dragging her name through town, poisoning her hard-earned place. When she finished, Denton leaned back, boots on the desk. "Well," he said, "he's clever, that one. But this isn't London, it's Wyoming. And over here, a man's reputation don't carry unless he earns it." He paused, then added, "You've been nothing but straight with folks. You beg for the old, stitch for the poor, fix saddlebags faster than McCall can ruin them. You think anyone gives a damn about an old dress shop in England?" Her throat tightened. "But he said he had documents." "Let him bring 'em. I've seen British legal threats before. The paper ain't even dry by the time they reach our hills. And unless he's got an extradition order, which I doubt, he's just a man with a mouth. Margaret stood. Thank you, Sheriff. He tipped his hat. You want backup, Miss Whitlow? You'll have it. Outside, the sun was climbing fast. She stood on the wooden walkway of Main Street and stared toward the saloon. The Dusted Boot, where Rupert had rented a room. She crossed the street without hesitation. Inside, the piano was silent and the smoke still asleep. A few early laborers were nursing coffee. Rupert sat at the bar reading a folded paper, looking for all the world like a lord at leisure. He looked up, smirked. Ah, decided to come to your senses. Margaret walked right up to him. No, she said, I came to end this. He raised a brow. You came here thinking I'd cower, that I'd tremble at the sight of old names and older threats. But I'm not the woman you remember, Rupert, and I'm not going back. He chuckled. You think you can just ignore your debts, the Whitlow name. Means nothing here. She leaned close, her voice sharp but quiet. I rebuilt myself from ashes. I've stitched clothes for children who don't speak my language. I've mended fences in the rain, buried neighbors I barely knew, and stood beside a man who holds silence better than most hold promises. I will not let you take this from me. He sneered. You can't stop me. Oh, but the law here can. And more than that, this town, these people. Try to spread your poison. See how far it gets you. She turned to walk out, but then paused at the door. And Rupert, she said without looking back, next time you cross an ocean to scare a woman, make sure she hasn't learned how to fight. By the time she returned to the ranch, Elijah was at the fence-lined shirt, off sweat glistening on his shoulders. He saw her riding in and came to meet her. Well, he asked. She dismounted, cheeks flushed with sun and adrenaline. It's done, she said. He raised a brow. I told him who I was, she added, and who I'm not anymore. Elijah smiled not with his mouth but with his eyes. The kind of smile that said everything and nothing. Margaret looked around at the land, the cabin, the barn, the prairie stretching golden and wild into the horizon. Then she looked at him. Elijah, she said quietly, I'm not just staying. He stepped closer. I'm building, she said, with you, if you'll have me. He touched her hand, rough palm against hers. I've been waiting for you to say that since the first time you stood in the rain and didn't flinch. They stood together as the wind picked up, rustling the grass like applause. Not as strangers, not even as survivors, but as two people finally choosing something, someone on purpose. Together, the first snow came early. Not a blizzard, not yet, but a quiet drift of white that dusted the tops of the fence posts and softened the sharp edges of the world. It fell overnight while Margaret slept in her own bed in her own cabin, the fire humming beside her and Elijah's steady breath rising and falling just across the room. Yes, he had moved in 2 weeks after Rupert left town with nothing but dust on his boots and failure in his chest. No fanfare, no declarations. Just a bag at the doorstep and a silent agreement written in shared labor and quiet dinners. Margaret had worried that his presence would disturb the peace she'd built, that living beside a man would reopen wounds she had stitched shut. But it didn't. Elijah came to her life like winter itself, gradual, certain, and strangely warm once you adjusted to the cold. She woke that morning to find him already up, standing at the small window, shirtless, his arms crossed as he looked out at the pale world beyond. It snowed, she said, voice still thick with sleep. He turned his expression soft. First time this year. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Is it always this quiet when it happens? He nodded. Snow's a hush. It covers everything. Even old grief if you let it. She rose and joined him by the window. Outside, the trees were still. A rabbit darted across the yard, leaving a trail of tiny footprints. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, lazy and pale against the white. I never saw snow in London like this, she murmured. There it was, gray slush and misery. This looks like forgiveness. He looked at her eyes deep with something unspoken. You ever regret coming here, he asked. She thought about it. The hunger, the fear, the heartbreak on the platform, the bunkhouse leaking in the storm. Rupert's shadow. Then she thought of the cabin, the curtains, the stew pot, the silence between them that no longer ached. No, she said, not once. They dressed and went outside together. Elijah fed the horses broke ice from the trough. Margaret hauled wood, her breath rising in clouds. It was work, but it was theirs. As she carried logs toward the cabin, she spotted something tucked beneath the porch railing, a small wooden box carved with clumsy hands. Inside, folded in red cloth, lay a silver ring. Not ornate, not grand, but simple, honest. Margaret turned. Elijah was watching her from the edge of the yard, hands in his coat pockets, snow in his beard. You didn't ask, she said. No, he replied. Didn't think I had to. She walked to him, the box in her hands. Is this what I think it is? He nodded. Not a proposal, a promise. She raised a brow. To what? To stay, he said. To keep showing up. To keep fixing fences and watching sunsets and leaving coffee warm on the stove. She smiled, tears rising without permission. That sounds like a kind of love. He touched her face gently. It's the only kind I know how to give. She slipped the ring on. It fit. Winter deepened. The days shortened. The world slowed. And in that quiet, Margaret and Elijah built more than just a life. They built trust. They built laughter. They built a rhythm that felt like prayer whispered in daily gestures, a mended glove, a second slice of cornbread, the fire always lit before the other returned home. No church bells, no legal vows, just two people who had earned every scar and still reached for each other anyway. And when the first hard freeze came, when the prairie turned silver and the sky glowed with the pale blue of December, Margaret stood on the porch in her wool shawl and whispered into the wind, I am not running anymore. From the bunkhouse to the cabin, from ruin to refuge, she had made her way home. And this time, this place, this man, this life, it was hers. To keep. The thaw came slowly, as it always did in Wyoming, first a drip from the eaves, then the groan of wet earth waking beneath the snow. By mid-March, the cottonwoods had begun to bud, and the river down the hill broke through its icy shell with a sound like glass shattering. Margaret was hanging laundry between two posts Elijah had set for her when the boy from the Pine Bluff post station rode up with dust on his boots and a letter in his coat. For Miss Whitlow, he said, squinting toward the porch. London mark on the seal, fancy ink. She stared at it in his outstretched hand. London. 2 syllables, 10,000 miles of memory. She thanked him, gave him a square of cornbread, and stood with the letter pressed against her apron as if it might burn through the cloth. Elijah found her an hour later, sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope unopened. He didn't ask questions, just poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. After a long silence, she said, It's from Emmeline. Elijah waited. My cousin. We grew up together. She was the only one who ever stood up to Rupert, the only one who stayed when the shop failed. She helped me pack my bag when I left. He sipped his coffee. You want to open it? I don't know. Then don't rush. She nodded. Then after a long moment, she broke the wax seal. The handwriting was the same as it had always been, elegant, even with the occasional blot from a hurried quill. My dearest Margaret, I have searched for months to find you. Rupert never told us what happened, only that you had vanished. I feared the worst until news reached a friend of mine who passed through America, and your name came up in some merchant's tale about a British woman running a frontier home with her own 2 hands. I'm writing because I have something I need to say, and because I believe it's never too late to speak kindness. Charles wasn't your failure. He was already drowning when he found you, and you, Margaret, you were the only one who tried to throw him a rope. You were not the ruin of our family. You were its only mercy. If you've ever wished to write or return, or simply let someone else remember you kindly, I am here, always. With love that never faded. Emmeline. By the time she finished reading, her hands were trembling. Elijah said nothing. She placed the letter down and stood moving to the window. The light outside was gold with spring's first promise. The buds on the trees trembled in the breeze, and the world once again seemed ready to bloom. She forgave me, Margaret said quietly. Or maybe she never blamed me to begin with. Elijah walked to stand beside her. You gonna write her back? She nodded. I think I will. He touched her shoulder gently. I'll ride it into town for you. She looked at him, and for the first time in months, a tear slipped free. Not from pain, but from the strange, quiet joy of being believed. That night, she sat at the table and wrote with the oil lamp flickering beside her. Her words were careful but not afraid, honest but not bitter. When she finished, she folded the letter, sealed it, and set it beside Elijah's saddlebag. Then she turned to the fire where he was mending a bridle and said, "Would you like me to take your name?" He looked up. A long pause passed between them. "Then only if it's something you want." "I do." He smiled, the kind that only came when no one else was watching. Then he stood, walked to her slowly, and kissed her forehead. "Then it's yours." Spring settled like a hymn across the valley. Birds returned, rivers swelled, and a single letter traveled east across an ocean, carrying with it not just words, but a woman reborn, no longer running from her name, but offering it forward. Margaret McCall, dressmaker, survivor, wife, builder of cabins and new beginnings. A woman who one stitch at a time had sewn herself into the world again. And so Margaret Whitlow, once a widow, with nothing but a battered suitcase and a bruised heart, found not only a place to lay her head, but a reason to rise each morning. In the hush of falling snow, the scent of fresh bread, the creak of a rocking chair beside the fire, she discovered what no letter, no man, no storm could take away. Home, not just a place, but a belonging. Not just a name, but a life stitched with purpose. And in the quiet strength of Elijah McCall, she learned that sometimes love doesn't come charging on horseback. Sometimes it simply stands beside you, silent, steady, and waiting. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the wind across the prairie and the firelight in Margaret's cabin, then saddle up and ride with us. Subscribe to The Wild Step, Wild West Stories for more tales of grit, grace, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. Stories not just of shootouts and saloons, but of courage, redemption, and the quiet heroes history almost forgot. Click that follow button, turn on the bell, and join us for the next ride. Because out here on the Wild Step, every heart has a story, and every story deserves to be told.